Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Research Network video series. In this series, we will explore research from a relational perspective. We will hear from people working with the relational research process and learn about related values, concepts, and practices. To start, here are some of our ideas. Research from a relational perspective embodies a philosophical and co-creative stance. It is thus not a method per se, but rather a collaborative way of being. Engaging from this perspective entails an ethical responsiveness to a focus of inquiry. Recognizing that reality is created through language and social structures means it can also be recreated. Relational research is a process that is attentive to broader relations and interactions. The purpose is to expand possibilities and co-create transformative potential. We hope you enjoy the series and invite you to join in the conversation. Tom Strong and Jerry Gale, a conversation. Relational research, how my research has impacted my life professionally and personally. Dr. Strong's research takes seriously the notion that conversational practice in counseling is where meanings and actions can be critically reflected upon, while new meanings and actions can be collaboratively developed.
Well, I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk about my still going on career as sort of a psychologist and an emeritus professor and someone who has an ongoing fascination for looking at communication. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that as I move on, but I think the big flags in my career, the ones that I would say I'm most proud of is I was 19 years at the University of Calgary. And during that time, I got to become a full professor, and I spent a lot of time with research because part of my time there was as an associate dean of research. And what that did was really get me involved with a lot of different methods. And so in my, accomplishments in that role as a professor, I've basically been looking two big picture grants that I got. One had me look specifically at conversational practices used by what I'll call discursive therapists. And for me, discursive therapists are those who use conversation intentionally in ways that are about changing clients' conversation that they have with themselves and others. And the most common of the discursive therapies to me are narrative, solution focused, collaborative. Those would be the ones that most commonly get referred to that way, at least by me. In my accomplishments, I would also add that I had a really good collaboration with Carl Tom, who I worked with probably for the better part of 10 plus years. And out of that came a book that he's the main editor of. I'm one of the editors. And that gave me another appreciation for what often is brought into this conversation, post-structural notions of communication, and how those still relate to things that in the olden days would have been called structural, namely the patterns that evolve in couples and in family therapy. Before I became an academic, I had 10 years as a practitioner. And it was in my time as a practitioner, I developed the questions that basically took me into the communicative interaction. The second of my big projects was also looking at more a critical discourse perspective on medical discourse in therapy. And I'll possibly say more about that later. With respect to relational research, I guess I would start with this idea that human beings are stitched together by their communications. And with that idea, therapists as well. And I've always been interested in the way in which our interactions with each other basically conserve particular, um, I hate the word realities in one sense, but I'll use it, conserve particular understandings or ways of being, or in some way are transformative. And by transformative, I mean enabling us to be able to move past particular patterns or practices that we've become accustomed to, or something that's more preferred, let's say. And I've been very interested in this idea of what it means to have preference animated conversation. And what does it mean to work with people where I need to negotiate my preferences with their preferences? Because I'm not a conversational eunuch. I'm not Carl Rogers, purportedly Carl Rogers, who was just a blank screen against which people could project, deeper and deeper layers of themselves, right? That my view coming out of things like solution-focused therapy or narrative therapy was that questions were like interventions in people's lives. And that is a piece of what I mean about relational research being in relational practice as being a sort of a negotiation of people's preferences and how they move forward in those preferences. Another part of what I've become more interested in the last while has been this idea that we're also relational with our technologies, with our sort of place, with our sense of the non-material aspects of our world. And I've become a lot more interested in recent times about that kind of relationship that human beings have, not only with each other, but with their technologies and with their sort of non-material aspects of who they are, who they're interacting with. What brought me to this particular focus or perspective was a combination of things. I think that initially, like a lot of therapists, I wanted to learn about how conversation changed people. I think one of the ways of thinking about conversation in therapy is that you use it very strategically. You use it like you're doing something on somebody. And that, in the end, that just didn't fit for me. And I did find a way to practice Ericksonian style without being that way. But what that moved me towards was a more collaborative approach to practice. And then I became interested in collaboration as this kind of preference animated negotiation. And I wanted then to study that. So when I made the decision to leave full-time practice, go into academic life, my initial interest was in looking at questions and looking at basically what it meant to negotiate, for example, in solution-focused therapy, a question and an answer, an adequate answer in the client's eyes to a miracle question. That would be one example of something that I did. And what does it mean? I became interested in a notion that I learned from one of my teachers, Doug Maynard, about what does it mean to complete an emotional gestalt in conversation? What does it mean to get to a place where somebody's raised something? And what does it mean for them to adequately complete that in a conversation with me or in a conversation that I'm studying someone else is having? And it's a complicated idea because in one sense, it is a very relational idea. How do we know that when we're talking with another person, they've been able to take their turn adequately, or they've been able to finish a stream of thought? i.e. an answer to a question or something like that. And I've been very interested in looking at that. So in the first round of the big grant that I got first time around, I looked at how people not only did these in sort of videotape question and answer sequences, but I invited them back to talk about that and use something called interpersonal process recall, where they could talk about, I mean, obviously they're not having the experience they had while they were being videotaped, but they could talk about this idea of completion, and they could talk about what it was like to be asked these questions and that kind of thing. And I had a good run of publications out of that, so people can go to my ResearchGate website and they'll find most of those things are all put up there. And then I think the other piece that really got me going down this pathway and looking at discourse really broadly was I got involved in a project with a colleague, Andy Locke, down in New Zealand. And we ended up doing a book that Cambridge published on, somewhere I could probably show you, that they published on social constructionism, sources and stirrings, yeah, in theory and practice. What that did to me was it really gave me a sense of looking historically at how people have looked at communicative interaction, and how I think Andy was probably more focused on the cognitive aspect. I was more focused on the relational interaction aspects. And so that brought me through hermeneutics, critical discourse theory, Wittgenstein, a number of the people who are involved with discourse analysis, including discursive psychology. And out of that, a whole range of projects came. I'm not going to get into all of them. But yeah, those two were the main things that brought me to that focus. And if I was to talk about what it is that makes that research feel special to me, and I just saw an example of this on ResearchGate the other day, is people, when I first did the work on discourse analysis and interpersonal process recall, I had a lot of pushback. A lot of people said, well, those are two separate things. And I said, yes, they are. And yet they relate to each other. And I just recently saw a couple of articles that started to use that. And I thought, well, it's interesting because before that, you had very few discourse analysis studies. Your dissertation was a good example of one of the pioneers in the area that interested me. And what that also did was privilege then the client voice on what that experience of doing these particular passages that I was analyzing looked like. So anyway, I mean, I recognize how different those two things are, but I still think it's interesting juxtaposing these two very different ways of looking at conversation. So there are a few aspects of my research, if I was to look at it in sort of themes, and one of the themes that I've been most interested recently is the way our conversations are overtaken by what I would call parasitic discourses nowadays. And these are discourses that often are very common discourses in everyday life, like DSM language, for example, and evidence-based practice, the way those two get stitched together as a kind of almost unified discourse of practice, and how little that gets questioned, and how ubiquitous that is in the public discourse as well. So I've been really concerned about looking at these ideas of how people often default to a particular way of talking and understanding, and what it means to go in and try to look at the idea of what I would call, plural discourses, what it means for people to gain a comfort in being able to, what linguists would say, code switch, how they would be able to, through their experience with a therapist, learn how to, describe their problem in multiple languages. And not that I'm against DSM all the way, but that they would have that as one of their discourses of understanding their concerns without making that the only one. Because I think the biggest worry I have for people is they get captured by a single discourse that they haven't had a chance to interrogate, and they haven't had a chance to look at alternatives. And I think all of that, to go back to the framing I talked about earlier, I'm concerned about how the relationship in a lot of the therapy literature gets portrayed. And as much as people don't like words like negotiate, I do think the relational piece of our work is a negotiation. And I think that what that then does, and I've written several different articles on conversational ethics and that, but what that then does is it makes me, as a practitioner, want to make my discourse contestable. And that's something that a lot of therapists have a discomfort with, because as an expert, ideally they're the ones who hear what the client has to say and then translate it into a discourse that is theirs, and then they convey back in that discourse how things are to be understood and done, kind of thing. I recognize that that doesn't cover everybody, okay? But I'm really interested in this idea of how do we work with people to overcome what Vico called linguistic poverty or discursive poverty. How do we help them develop multiple ways of talking about their concerns or addressing their concerns? And that has been one of my bigger interests in the last few years, as, in what way, and I'm very mindful of narrative therapy, or often starting with this idea that there's a dominant discourse that and very marginalized pretenders to understanding or whatever, that as the people who are in the dominant discourse would think of it. Whereas in narrative therapy, there are these outlier discourses that haven't been brought in, and haven't become part of the new story, so to speak. And I'm interested in how we have conversations that help people become multidiscursive, if you want to think of it that way. And I'm going to go one extra step with that. That in their ways of talking, especially in couple and family therapy, they will have habits of talk that may or may not be serving them as well. So when I say multidiscursive, I'm meaning that I want to be able to hopefully join them in changing not just the content of their talk and the way that plays out, but the way in which they do their talk, so that they have more flexibility where they maybe become a little more rigidified or something like that over time. And I think those two things go together in one sense, but a lot of people relate to discourse in a very cognitive way. And I think of it as conversational practice. So yeah. If I was to think of my impact, what makes my research, let me go to my impact. I honestly think that I've had a very marginal impact on psychotherapy. I mean, I think what I notice is there's a group of us, and I include you in this, who get invited to bring this perspective to let's say academic debates on things. And I had a lot of invitations to do things around the DSM for a while, and that was cool. But my hope has always been that many of these ideas that we're talking about, the way of looking at discourse in practice, would become much more a focus of what it is that would be regular counselor training, would be part of the way in which people would come to approach developing even their own professional identities, all of those kind of things. And I think it's been a piecemeal kind of deal, you know. And so, you know, I would say I've been trying to assess myself as an academic this last while. I would say if there was sort of a C, B, and A league, very little on the A level.
Now recording.
Okay. On the B league level of what I've been able to contribute, I think that I'm really very happy about my network that I have. I have a very good network of people that I get to collaborate with. And I think that where I would think my influence has been the greatest has probably been in bringing a discursive perspective to some arenas of discussion within therapy and psychology and family therapy. And I mean, I think the work that I did with Carl Tom, I think some of that has had some ripples and I don't know. I mean, I think through the different students and that I've worked with, who are now many of them are they've got academic positions, so that's really gratifying. And yeah, so on scholars, on I think that I think that I would have in Canada a solid reputation for making contributions of different kinds. They weren't all discourse analysis contributions. Some of them are about relational practices. One recent article that's coming out. And so I think that among my colleagues, I left academia, you know, the formal part of it in a good way. And I feel good about my relationships and stature, if you want to call it that. I would love to, you know, I'm the Canadian counseling psychology DSM guy in one sense, but I'm also the guy that writes about discourse analysis and things like that. With clients, that's where it gets interesting. And I know we were talking about that before the tape went on, but I think one of the things that I've noticed, not just with clients, but also unless I'm really involved in a heated conversation, for the most part, I've come to think of this idea of the emotional gestalt that we've been talking about earlier in a way that I think has created a lot more space for the people I'm talking with, clients included, students that I still supervise, all of that. And that I'm interested in what it means for them to feel like they've adequately completed what they're saying in a preferred way. And doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily agree with them at the end of it, but I mean that they've had their say and that, you know, all of that has occurred. I think what it's done in my family therapy practice is it's really made me much more aware of the way that others sort of communicate in ways that I guess disrupt that sense of emotional gestalt with each other, but also and it tunes me more to this idea of conversational practices that they have. And what I mean by that are their relational habits, you know, and what it means to kind of see those regardless of what they're talking about. See the how of their talk is a lot more significant to what I do because in many cases, the what is very secondary to the practice that basically people are caught up in, right? I think it's made me a lot better about looking at my own conversational interventions. Like, again, I think of questions as interventions, as things that need their own processing time and need to have their own gestalt, if you want to think of it that way. And, you know, so I would say that having looked a lot closer at talk has made me like, conversation analysis gets you to look at microseconds, right? And so I've become a lot more interested in how people, whether they intend it or not, do things like pauses, or how they amplify their talk and intensity wise, or, how the cadence of their talk goes. And I've been interested in self-monitoring myself in that regard better too as well. So how has the research impacted? Well, I just started down that path. I think I've always had an interest. I mean, my early interest in social constructionism came probably out of therapy, like solution focused and narrative to begin with. And then I went to the body of ideas we call social constructionist. And it was like that because I was interested in trying to better make sense of what this narrative therapy or solution focused therapy was about. What does it mean to have authoring conversations? Or what does it mean to deconstruct? And a lot of times when I read the accounts of that stuff in the regular books that were out there, by the practitioner authors, which I continue to like, by the way, but a lot of times it just felt inadequately explained to me. And so the research really moved me into much more reading and much more looking closely at conversation. On a personal level, I think that, boy, I've got a much broader curiosity about conversation than I ever did before that. And a lot broader, like I'm in a new relationship right now, and I'm very interested in just looking at myself and looking at our communications and all of that and seeing what that's like, And yeah, I mean, I think on other levels, what it's done is probably also on the critical discourse side, made me a lot more interested in social justice kinds of reading. I think I always had that, but I think I now read it differently, and I now relate to social justice issues differently. And you're asking, were there challenges? Oh my God. You and I could talk about one we had with my own funding body, where they totally misread what we meant by, I called it IPR conversations earlier, interpersonal process recall. One of our partners, who's since gone on to do a lot of this kind of research, by the way, Jerry, I don't know how much you followed Adam's work in recent times, but it's all been about ruptures in therapy and looking at looking at conversation analysis in the working alliance. So what I mean by that, for people who aren't familiar with all that stuff, I think that a challenge has been to get misread by people, and a challenge has been to it's been interesting because I was hired into my program as the postmodern guy, and what that meant when it came to things like discourse analysis and discourses plural was, I think that was a bit threatening to the humanists that I work with, because generally they think of things in a more kind of realist and core humanist discourse, and I was talking something different, but still had their social justice flavor. So it was very interesting, that part. And I mean, if anything, I mean, I think I was benefiting from it less than being challenged by it, because I mean, it was that reason I was, I think, conscripted to be an associate dean of research and that kind of thing. So, I mean, but I mean, it would be very different for me to sit in these boards and stuff like that with people who didn't have a discourse perspective and what that meant to them, and all of that. So how would my life be different if I didn't do this line of research? Oh my God. That's an unfair question. I mean, that's a big question. I think that I think I'd be back to trying to find the grail of some sort, about what it is, that's the real and the the only and the best and all that kind of stuff. And I think what thinking about things through a more discursive relational lens has done is made me think that I can't, pardon the pun, trump another person's reality with my own accounts of things. That I have to look at, if I want to get to a common understanding, then I need to be able to negotiate that with people and leave space for their understanding as part of that. I think if I hadn't done that, then the whole business of getting exposed to discourse and relational research, I think I likely would have been much more an ideologue who wanted to impose on others his superior knowledge kind of deal, right? So, yeah. So, other thoughts I might have. I wish there was more of a community of people who were doing discursive research. Um, I'm lucky to be connected to different researchers doing different projects with research that's discourse like. And I'm still kind of surprised that there aren't more journals and more specific conferences that bring together discourse and therapy and discourse analysis and therapy. I mean, I do think that there's been a lot more reading of discourse analysis studies and therapy. And I mean, I would go to my own ResearchGate account and look at some of my articles that I wrote 10, 15 years ago that now are really starting to get a lot of uptake, and I mean, I think that's good, but I think what that says to me is people are interested in that work and they want to be able to, I don't know, find a community at some point. That's the academic in me thinking that way. And, I mean, I do run a listserv with my students and former students, and then other people who sort of the hangers on, if you like, from conferences and things like that who got involved. It's not very active right now, but I do like the idea of swapping ideas with people and experiences and using discourse and theory and discourse analysis. So, what would I recommend to new scholars? Um, well, I know if we had my students here, part of this conversation, they would say, Tom would say, read Harold Garfinkel and read John Heritage's, book on Harold Garfinkel. And um, I would say that Garfinkel was one of the more profound influences on my life. Um, and he is not somebody who gets talked about at all in the counseling literatures, other than by CA types and conversation analysis people and that. If what I would say is where things have gotten interesting is the whole discursive psychology movement. And there is now quite a body of scholars who are going more in that kind of direction that Jonathan Potter and Derek Edwards started, 30 years ago, 40 years, 35 years ago kind of thing. And, their ambition was to sort of dismantle this idea that psychological discourse was in some way instrumental in the ways that people thought it was, and their interests grew to more like, how do we produce a cognition in therapy? How do we get to a place where emotions are occasioned by discourse, that kind of thing. I would suggest people go and have a read of that stuff. Of course, people like Foucault give you almost a more hermeneutic version of discourse than you would get by reading discourse analysts, right? And I still think that's very rich and useful. And I think that there's always going to be a role for the people who like to use critical discourse to go and try to address hegemonies and dominances and that out there. and people like Norman Fairclough. I think some of the others who I really gravitate towards. Ian Parker would take that kind of view as well. They're just really useful resources in those ways of doing research that I think people would find useful. So I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping I've been on task here, Jerry, and yeah.
Tom, I'm going to continue talking with you in a moment, but I want to bring this to a close and give you my appreciation. I appreciate this kind of broad arc of Tom Strong and your journey in language, and literally in the sea of language, because I think that's the work you're doing and others are doing. It's often invisible, but yet it's the world we live in.
Yep.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you to Jerry Gale and Tom Strong. To learn more about Tom, please visit www.tausinstitute.net/Tom-Strong. Please join in the conversation. What captured your attention in this video? How do you think these ideas reflect a relational orientation to research? Leave a comment on the YouTube page or join our community at www.tausinstitute.net/relational-research-network. There you can find links to our mailing list, Facebook page, future events, and a lot more. We thank the Relational Research Network leadership team for the vision and dedication to making this video series come to life.